Hello, this is Stephen Robinson, or the play typer guy, as my son calls me. That's a fair description, I guess. And I'm happy to have Caitlin Bird from Dame Magazine, an overall political commentator. Really, I've enjoyed following your work, reading your work on Dame, which I want to also take a moment to please read, support some great journalism there. Um, from voices that don't get columns at the Atlantic, which is my sort of subtle segue. So let me jump into this while my wife is still listening to this. So Tom Nichols, who's a prominent former Republican never Trumper, had an article in the Atlantic about Ron DeSantis. And I should also clarify, Nichols is not pro DeSantis, but he's very anti minorities and specifically people of color, saying that DeSantis is a fascist. So he's like, well, no, he's not. He's just doing stuff to appease the base, even though trying to appease the base is beating up on minorities and some folks. So I'm just going to read this one specific um, paragraph and throw to Caitlin here because she has a lot of great thoughts on it. So he writes, elections have consequences. If the people of Florida, through their electoral choices, want to wreck one of their own colleges, it is within the state's legitimate power to do so. In fact, Florida could decide tomorrow to amend its own constitution and abolish state universities entirely. There's no national right to a college education, and if Florida wants to unleash a battalion of Guy Montags on its state colleges and their libraries, well, that's up to the voters. So, Caitlin, is that up to the voters? Is that a fair description
Uh,
of democracy?
I mean, I think it's just like a wildly ahistorical take on um, particularly educational institutions, but on state governance in general. You'd think that somebody, well, I generally think about like political commentators should keep certain things in mind when they sit down and they write things like this, which is things like your governor can do whatever he wants. Like, you should stop and think about like the reeling consequences. Shouldn't you go and find some historical analog? Like, what would it be? Like no one who knows the name George Wallace should also say something as ridiculous as your governor can do whatever he wants. There's no right to, privately served accommodations at lunch counters. Sir, like if you can switch these words out and it sounds really bad, like you're pro segregation, you should stop and think about your entire framework for analysis.
Well, especially because, as the old saying goes, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. So, you know, and I've seen this overall. I think you have as well, and we've spoken about it on Twitter, where unfortunately a lot of liberals, and I hate the term, but for lack of a better term, blue states will dismiss red states as if it's like 100% Klan participation voting, and that no one, like from Tennessee to Kentucky to the worst parts of Alabama, are not voting against all of this stuff and are being harmed by these policies. So even if you have like, and DeSantis, definitely kicked Chris' butt. Marco Rubio won overwhelmingly, unfortunately, but we're still talking about worst case scenario, 60% to 40%. That's not that doesn't give the 60% of those voters the right to oppress the remaining 40%. That can't be what democracy means specifically. And I think Nichols ignores this, right? If you look at what's happening, it's not the voters, it is a sort of white Christian nationalism, which is spreading across the country or gaining more power. A white Christian nationalist movement actively oppressing a minority of the population, particularly Black people and queer people. All of his policies are targeted towards harming these groups who are not voting for it. 90% of Black women in Florida voted against DeSantis. They do not want to suddenly not have Black history taught in schools, or to have the schools they could send their kids to, because, and people mentioned this to Nichols and he sort of rolled his eyes. It's like, well, out of state tuition is pretty expensive. So, the Black mom pitching her pennies to send her kids to University of Florida can't be like, okay, well, let me just send them to the University of Washington or some other school. Like, that's not a solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only that. There's a certain amount of, I mean, part of the reason that there was such a conservative resurgence in Florida was the collapse of the local Democratic Party,
Mm-hmm.
and importantly, the efforts made in after 2018 to actively undermine the turnout of groups that would support the Democratic Party and
Mm-hmm.
would make more of a stand and make it a narrower race for Ron DeSantis. So it kind of ends up being a natural feedback loop, right? Which is the same thing that we saw with Jim Crow, which is the same, like the voter suppression isn't a demonstration that everyone agrees. Like,
Yes.
you can't take the outcomes of elections where people are being actively suppressed and actively undermined in terms of the representation, and then use it as an excuse for why you should leave even more power in the hands of people who have suppressed said voters.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
of
how
course,
can you write that and not mention, like, DeSantis who's not a fascist? We should not go crazy and call him a fascist, according to
oh
Nichols.
yeah,
But his literal election fraud squad arresting Black people for voting and creating a sort of intimidation that has to have a ripple effect, because he had press conferences saying, I've arrested these former, bad people who tried to vote. And so people probably weren't voting, or, all this sort of what he's doing is pretty clearly textbook, to try to suppress the vote and to just sort of dismiss it and say, and again, even if it was just he had done nothing to try to rig the vote, the 30% of minority, of people who don't want to be oppressed should not be left to fend for themselves.
oh yeah. I mean, fundamentally, it's a very authoritarian view of democracy, a kind of notion of a zero-sum democracy in which majority rules, or in a more comedic take of the time, 60% of the time it works all the time. um Voting, yeah, 60% of the voters get 100% of the results is doesn't sound like a reasonable function of an actual representative state, right? And that's kind of the point, is that democracy requires compromises. There's certain things that you can't compromise on, but whether or not people get representation in their own history, whether or not education is a broad or a narrow concept, these are very fundamental things. And the other thing is that, like, we've never gotten to a place where we actually are teaching history correctly. I mean, Florida is returning in many ways to its roots as a white supremacist state. It has always been one. Kind of gained a reputation for being more moderate as New Yorkers packed southern Florida, as people from outside of Florida flock there for retirement. But it's got a very long history as a Jim Crow state. And I think that kind of gets erased because of its unique status and the way it functions versus the more traditional Old South. Nonetheless, Black Floridians have not forgotten, and point out the obvious, they're still doing this is a direct attack on the consistency of that history, the
Mhm.
reality that it was a Jim Crow state, that it was a Jim Crow state in the same way that South Carolina, the same way Alabama, the same way Mississippi were Jim Crow states. And that DeSantis putting a new spin on it doesn't change the fundamental fact that there is a consistent history of suppressing minority voices in Florida.
and it's sort of dangerous beyond Nichols, but when the New York Times describes this authoritarian march, this a clear targeting of marginalized people. So a man whose entire agenda has been attacking diversity, equity, inclusion programs, attacking Black history, attacking all these perceived woke things, attacking queer people. The New York Times frames as DeSantis taking on the establishment, and I always said that, like, when the Times writes something as if that's what the PR person wants, that's how I want to be presented, that's a problem. Like, well, how did we're not the establishment, we don't have power as in people of color, so he's attacking us. Like, what do you mean that he's taking on the establishment? That's sort of a very scary reading, and the Times has, again, as you say, a history of doing that, like when it was covering Hitler in the 30s. And going back to Nichols, I wanted your thoughts on this, because prior to the election, he had tweeted something about how we needed to stop talking about race or being brought into those culture war discussions. We can have the luxury to have these discussions once democracy is safe, because there's the idea that Trump could come back and all of this stuff, because Democrats were foolishly doing all this woke stuff and they were going to get crushed. And it wasn't as bad as people had thought. But at the time, the prevailing argument was that all of this woke stuff trying to protect queer people, again, defending people, like, we did not start the fire, right? We did not try to, we were just defending people who were being attacked, would jeopardize the ability to keep Trump and MAGA folk out of power. And what I found, for those who are just only listening but not watching, Caitlin had rolled her eyes, rightly so. What I found strange, and I remember tweeting this, was, okay, well, when people talk about democracy at stake, and I think you've commented on this, is why it's often not as resonating when Democrats had talked about democracy at stake in connection to Trump, when they are not willing to link that to the experience of Black people. Because, okay, well, what do you mean democracy is at stake? If you were to say that 1950s America was a functioning democracy, and God forbid you were to say otherwise, we saw what happened to Nicole Hannah-Jones for even daring to suggest this. But if you believe 1950s or even parts of the America in 1960s were functioning democracies, then I'm going to be concerned when you talk about securing democracy, because basically the Jim Crow South, Jim Crow America, post-World War II America, is your idea of a functioning democracy, and it wasn't for a lot of Black people. So what is your thoughts about when people like Nichols, just white moderates, white liberal, even some white liberals in general, talk about democracy without necessarily connecting it to what Black people have experienced in America?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise to me that someone like Nichols is ultimately a reactionary, which it has to be kind of fundamentally it's like, what is his political stance? Like, what does he actually believe? What is his ideal political structure? And one in which race gets erased from the actual discussion of what it means to represent people in a functional, I want to say, I like saying representative instead of republic or democracy, because people attach emotionally to these words and then say, well, specifically, and that way I just like curtail around the entire republic and not a democracy argument. But a representative government, which can be either a democracy or a republic or both, ultimately comes down to whether or not it has representatives who are there as a function of public interest, as a function of the needs of the entire population. You should not have significant gaps in who gets to speak and who gets to participate, and these should be levied to not only provide protection to these groups, but also equality. And one in which he can't conceive of the political inequality, let alone the racial and structural inequalities that have tormented Black voters in particular across this country's history. It's easier to use Black voters simply because we are one of the longest standing groups that has been excluded specifically from the polity versus having our own nations or being relatively immigrants. We have been here from inception. And so you can kind of track very cleanly our arc as members of the polity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this doesn't apply to other groups. It's just that Black people are the easiest ones to kind of do this comparison for. So I think what's really important is to kind of of course, like Nichols doesn't recognize that. And a lot of white reactionaries don't recognize that because it would undermine the entire argument that they'd like to make, which is that nothing needs to change. And everything comes down to, we do not want to change how any of this functions. And of course, Nichols also has an emotional, psychological investment in denying the amount of terrible shit he did, which is, he was an accomplice to the modern GOP. I think anybody who's an accomplice but hasn't denounced their Bush era stuff doesn't get to say anything about it, because as I like to remind people, to no avail, regularly, Alberto Gonzales, the entire scandal about him as AG and the replacement of U.S. attorneys for political reasons was because they were not prosecuting enough cases of voter fraud. And this has been a long-standing attack from Republicans. John McCain in 2008 talking about Acorn and undermining again, Black and minoritized voter organization, which is basically just to do signups, just to make sure people are engaged. In 2012, Mitt Romney was obsessed with unskewing polls and just continuing to go with significantly whiter electorates as part of his baseline, and saying that you're undercounting Republican voters when that's not the case. In fact, presidential turnout years have massive waves of, what a surprise, minoritized voters, marginalized voters who tend to get activated when there's a giant cultural push for people to be engaged at the top of the ticket. And we saw this happen over and over again before Trump showed up. So none of this is a surprise. And the fact that he can't trace it, and that history is always existing in a vacuum for these people, it's whatever they're feeling at any given moment. This is just another example of that kind of failure.
Because recently, right now during the debt ceiling negotiations, Republicans are trying to frame it as a getting woke stuff out of the budget and ripping all the wokeness and whatever. And I'd written something about how linking this to Ronald Reagan's narratives about welfare queens, his ability to essentially gut the social safety net by realizing, even if white people like some of these policies and like some of these things, I can gut all of this if I link it to anything that seems to be helping Black people or where Black people are benefiting more. And there was some feedback of like, why are you talking about Reagan? That was so long ago. And it's like, well, it's a direct line. And if you just want to like, where did woke come from? And either dismiss it, which we'll often see, it'll either be like, oh, this is a new thing that Republicans are doing, which it's not, or this is easily going to fail. Well, no, Reagan, essentially had a nuclear event. The Reagan era was a nuclear event for Black progress, for anything that occurred in the 60s from the civil rights movement, what he did with HUD, even like not prosecuting obvious instances of redlining, bank discrimination, furthering the racial wealth gap. That's important. It's important to talk about Reagan because he's part of also sort of that, which you see from, you can expect Republicans to do this perhaps, but arguably a lot of Democrats want to frame Trump as distinctly different from Reagan and even Bush. And I know that always drives you crazy when you see folks doing that. But the idea of, you'll see this from Pelosi, from Biden, of like, these are these were the good Republicans. Maybe we disagreed with them, but they weren't like, Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever. And look, I certainly, from a mobster perspective, I get like, Liz Cheney, I disagree with everything that she has to say, but okay, she's not going to put a bomb in my car. She's going to try to get me in other ways. Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to put a bomb in my car. So, I get that they're not the same, but this whole sort of, it's dangerous to sort of embrace this kind of narrative that what we're seeing is not a slow and steady progress and backlash against the civil rights movement, all the rights revolutions that we saw.
Yeah, there's also something about this notion of not wanting to embrace us or them rhetoric, which I totally understand from a pluralistic society standpoint, right? You don't want to actually start endorsing the eliminationist rhetoric of your opponents by using your own kind of extreme language to categorize them. At the same time, you can't fight a war on one side. I think there was a line at the end of one of my pieces, which was like, a war only one side fights is a massacre.
Yeah.
Like
I love that one. Yes.
Yeah, and ultimately it comes down to, if you're going to, we can't be the only ones like playing by rules. Ultimately, in order to enforce the rules, there has to be a point at which you say absolutely not, no more. You have to set a line, and they say, if you cross this line, everyone who crosses this line and is not denounced for crossing said line is going to be treated as an enemy. Mm-hmm. This is not because we want to get into a fight with you, but it is because at this point, we cannot be in concert with you. We cannot be in solidarity with you. We cannot coordinate with you. We cannot treat you as respectable opponents. This is our line. This is the point at which the disrespect has gone too far, and we can't be a functioning government if you insist upon crossing it. And if you know that this is the line of forehand, if you know before we start anything that we are not going to tolerate this particular behavior, then it makes very clear what is not going to be allowed. And similarly, I'm a Civil War aficionado. Mostly the political history of the Civil War. People love to be like, okay, so what about this battle thing? Like, I don't give a fuck about military history. Just don't talk to me. But the political history is not taught, and it's surprisingly, because so many white men love the Civil War, the political history of the war is horribly neglected. Wonder why.
It is scarily similar. Like the post-Obama, so everyone's like, everything's great, we've elected the first Black president, and then the Tea Party comes, and I'm like, this is very similar to a lot of Reconstruction, where it's like, oh, Blacks are freed, and like, we're senators now, and oh crap, like the Klan and whatever. Literally groups called the Red Hats that were attacking, that were going after folks. So this was not surprising. And what you were just talking about, like the lead up to the war, like a lot of stuff, and a lot of narratives I don't know, like the idea that, and this kind of comes back to the Florida argument, that I see certainly even among Democrats of like, okay, well, let Florida be Florida. I, how dare you even suggest that me as let's say a white woman with means move to Florida and try to either organize or even just increase the population so that we can actually be competitive in the state again. Because it's terrible. I don't want to live there, even though, minorities do. I'm going to go be secure in my blue state here in Oregon, which almost flipped, by the way, at the governor's race. The problem with that is that there is no escaping. And I think if you look at the history of the Civil War, if you buy the lost cause narrative of the war of northern aggression, and I grew up at a time where that was the joke. Every nice Southern lady talked about, oh, that war of southern, war of northern aggression. That's not what happened. It was a war of southern aggression, which is just like, we want slavery everywhere. We want, that was what the Fugitive Slave Act was about, and which you wound up getting with people with abortion rights saying, well, I actually don't want women leaving the state and getting abortions elsewhere. I don't want them going and rules against laws against trans people and queer people, banning Black. That's going to be everywhere. There is no running from it. Like, there's no that is sort of an annoying meme of like Bugs Bunny carving Florida. It's like, those are 30 electoral votes and 2 senators. The Senate is structured the way it is. Electoral college is structured the way it is. So, unless we make certain moves and start winning states again that Obama had won, like Ohio, Florida, Iowa, like, there's no room for error. Like, if we only win Senate seats in states that a president can win, Democratic president can win at the top of the ticket, that means we're sort of maxed out at 50. That we are in a bad shape. We've got to do something to fix that. And that means perhaps going into these states and, of course, not essentially abandoning minorities and marginalized groups to, Jim Crow style leaders. But what is your thought on that, Caitlin, when you see folks who are sort of, screw Florida, screw even Tennessee or so forth?
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting, again, being a Civil War aficionado, being a fan of Black history, is that you can, if you leave a fire burning out of control in one place, it's not going to stay in that place. As long as it has fuel, it will spread. And the notion of like, okay, you can just leave the terrible shit in that state is almost exactly what they're trying to kind of goad you into doing, because when you do that, you allow it to percolate. It is not going to get stuck in that state. One of the major catalysts for the Civil War wasn't just slavery. The simplistic answer is slavery, and it is. Slavery is engulfed in all of it. But the huge catalyst was the insistence that slavery needed to grow. The knowledge that if it stayed contained within the existing states, and only those states, and was not allowed to expand, it would die. Mm-hmm. They choked off the oxygen, it would die. You weren't allowed to. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about with DeSantis, the entire concept is, if you suppress knowledge about certain things, particularly Black history, particularly the understanding of the Black relationship to white America, these things are really, really important for illuminating how toxic so many of the structures are. But also, more importantly, it's exactly what Southerners did in the run-up to the Civil War. They would not allow you to discuss slavery as a political issue. You were literally, there was a discussion that was supposed to be had about whether or not they should ban slavery from the District of Columbia. And this was in the 1850s. And again, a huge chunk of the discussion, as they got upset about it, was, they just had this whole fight over whether or not you could send abolitionist materials to rich white people in southern states. And basically the answer was no. They used federal control over the post office. Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun, and the super racist head of the Postal Service at the time all agreed that what they were going to do was make it illegal to transmit abolitionist teaching via the mail into southern states. So you can't mail anything. And abolitionists were like, because they were like, oh, if it reaches our enslaved people, they'll rise up and they'll murder us. And I was like, this I love how you managed to keep two thoughts in your head at the same time. One, slavery is great for Black people and they love it. And two, if they find out anything other than slavery, they're going to murder us all in our sleep. It's like, do you ever find your brain trying to like hold those two things together and finding that they don't go together at all? Like, do you ever find your brain trying to explode out of your head? Because you read these logic lines and you're like, so if it's great. Anyway, the point is
well,
that
it's like not teaching slaves to read.
exactly.
As if so slaves are no better than pigs, but don't teach them how to read. As if like passing a law of like, don't try to like, look, Caitlin, if you want to teach your cat to sing and dance, if you want to teach your cat to sing and dance, God love you. Well, it's not working.
Is working on it. No, but the point is that like, these things don't go together. And interestingly enough, enslaved people were allowed to learn how to read until the Nat Turner Rebellion, at which point where apparently abolitionist literature was in fact read and used through his pulpit, at which point they were like, well, maybe we should kill all these people. Not a bad thought, but not a strategically sound one. Nonetheless, that was part of the reason you got like this really strong pushback, which was basically like, if you let them read this stuff, and they were like, we're not sending, just to be clear, we sent a bunch of abolition stuff in the mail to white people. Slaves do not get mail. So we're confused as to how exactly we're supposed to have been instigating an uprising via something that people can't read and they won't get. So explain to us why the post is somehow this revolutionary tactic. And there's a lot of pushback around free speech. It was one of the first big free speech arguments that happened in the US, and they lost, abolitionists lost. But interestingly enough, you had the suppression of like anything, then when there was like, okay, well, we can't even talk about slavery as a political issue, as a political issue itself, that itself was instigation. Mm-hmm. You couldn't, and people were like, you can't disseminate the arguments in Congress about slavery to Southern states now. You can't say anything.
And that's eerily similar to now. We can't discuss race as a political issue. And so part of, and I mentioned your thoughts on that. So the College Board kind of, I guess, folded and didn't make the change. And so removed sort of what right-wingers would describe as anything that is activism, which includes reparations, which is not sort of activism. It's like reparations was sort of, how do you understand post-Civil War history without understanding reparations, the push for reparations, both pro and con, and no discussion of that, no discussion of, and it's fascinating because you noted this, and I think Nichols, I don't think specifically to you, but broader, had been frustrated because it was like, well, I'm different from this writer, but conservatives had for years gone on about the loss of academic freedom at universities. And it was some area where I was somewhat a fellow traveler there, because I tend to be like, I'm all for all ideas being taught. I just don't think you should invite, Ben Shapiro to your university because he's a moron and you shouldn't pay money for that. But if someone is, I'm sorry if your Black conservative thought is diamond and silk, right? Maybe there's a problem that over here, you've got all these great, that I couldn't name them all, Black thinkers, and then conservatives are bringing them out. So they've had better than diamond and silk. I assume they would bring them out, and now it's just silk. But their argument was against any sort of, Ta-Nehisi Coates and all these great thinkers could not be taught as a political, because it's all about advocacy, and it's not even just sort of the that I disagree. It's just that the 1619 Project is inherently racist and anti-American. Not just I disagree with the interpretation. And they do a lot of kind of, and I'm sure you've seen this on your own arguments, it'll be like trying to argue, okay, well, she got this date wrong, and that's why I'm debunking it. But really, my issue is just that she's pointing out that slavery was a major part of American history. and that white people didn't nicely come along and free Black people and give us rights. It was a constant battle. There was a clear antagonist and a clear against us receiving rights. And that's the story they don't want to tell. And I think I remember reading on Facebook years ago, this very nice white lady, she had adopted a Black child, a Black girl, and was talking about, I need to learn about Black history, which, okay, well, you're 35, but all right. And she's reading all this stuff, Frederick Douglass and W.D. Du Bois, and no Black women, of course. But she gets to MLK, and then afterward, like, everyone is living, she seems to have a problem with. And like, I think it ends with her reading Coates and being like, oh, he seems very angry. So it's just that sort of summed up kind of how America wants Black history to be taught, right? None of the angry living Black people, and very sanitized versions of dead Black people.
Yeah, there's like a whole, that's like a, I need to like write a thesis like about like, that whole story. I remember I was the only Black kid in my civil rights elective in my senior year of high school. It was a boarding school in Massachusetts, so it was gonna be white. It was just like, how white was it gonna be? And the answer was almost 100%, except for me. And there was a lot of pressure inside that class. But afterwards, I had a friend who's Canadian American now. She's just got naturalized, but was just Canadian at the time, and therefore had no express understanding of the U.S. side of race relations. That's why she was taking the class. And we were friends because she actually wanted to learn things. And this is a 16-year-old child. So I'm going to give her some slack on not being as well informed, because that's what school is for. And we left class one day and she was like, how are you not angry all the time? Like, how are you just not on a constant level of rage? And it was like, I don't have time to be angry all the time. Like, it would just sap all of the energy that has to go to anything else I'd like to achieve. As I've gotten older, I figured out better ways of integrating the anger all the time. But the fundamental truth is that those Black people were angry in their time.
Oh, yeah.
They're white people. The anger is a reflection not of hostility and not something to be afraid of, but something to reckon with. Right? Because Black people, again, there are so many times that if you look at it, it's like there's so many opportunities for sabotage, and Black people didn't do it until it was opportunistic, until it became the cost benefit analysis worked out that we could stay living, because we could be angry to the point where we self-immolate. There is a righteousness to that anger, but it wouldn't allow us to do what we actually want to do, which is be free. And the lack of understanding that exists inside that, I mean, that's actually what they're trying to prevent. They're trying to prevent the understanding, the reckoning with a very righteous anger that doesn't want to destroy. It's not interested in destruction. Black anger is about getting a due, getting something that's been denied. And if you were frequently denied something, you too would be very angry. And if you had no right to be denied that thing, you too would be very angry. And we consider so many things that white people should be denied, like elections that they lost, to be things that like you don't get the right to, but they get angry anyway. And we validate that anger. We say, it's okay that you're upset about losing an election. It's not. Get over yourselves. Go home, reorganize, think about the issues that animate you, and come back fresh in 2 years. That's what the rest of us have to do. Like, I was super mad about Hillary losing, but you didn't see me setting fire to cars and shit.
Oh, yeah. And white
I would have a right to, though. He stole that. Like, I think we can establish that. We established
yes,
that.
you have
one, right? That wasn't legit.
You and I are both Hillary Clinton supporters who people assume we are not Hillary Clinton supporters because we are sometimes critical of Democrats. Um, I Yeah, I mean, white anger gets you like Marjorie Greene's elevation in the party because she legitimately represents the party and the base. And I think that there is an argument that there's that fear of black anger. And again, I'm not criticizing Democrats, but Democrats are the ones who don't want to run Caitlin Byrd. They want to run kind of like, I'm going to go and get stuff done for everyone and, vote for me despite my race. I'm certainly not angry. There's no reason for us to be angry. Or if we're angry, it has to be something that unites all of us in the anger. So like, say, I'm upset about 9/11, but not about, potentially police violence or so forth. And that is potentially dangerous. But I think there is some white moderate, and people like Nichols have, I wouldn't say infiltrated the Democratic Party, but they are part of the party now. They specifically, here are the people we believe should be running and against, against Trump. And their push is very much, don't be scary. Don't be angry. There's nothing to be angry about. Let's just tweak things around the margins. You say make no substantive changes. Let's get back to the points where the folks in a country club could get along, which was traditionally all white people in that country club. But that seems to be their kind of their push. And it is interestingly reflective of the two bases. So, I would say there was a period where obviously the March of the Greens weren't the face of the party. The face of the party may be more Nancy Mace types or whatever. The politics are Nikki Haley's, but the politics haven't changed. What they want is still the same. But what are your thoughts, wrap this up on a positive note? Like, what can be done in places like Florida and other states? Because I feel like we have to fight, as you so eloquently put it, you've got to put those fires out. They won't be contained, it just can't be ignored. And there's no place to run. And Republicans have made it clear that they will want to make Florida the case for the world, the country. Like, so what can we do? Like, what would you suggest?
Well, first, I mean, thank you so much because that's like a brilliant setup. And while I did think about like fire as a metaphor, the honest truth is that Ron DeSantis is arguing that Florida should be an example to the nation. This should be a thing that happens everywhere. That if you give him power over the federal government, it will be. If you give him the powers of the presidency, he will make Florida happen everywhere. And the long-term repercussions, I mean, the short-term repercussions should be high. That's one of the first ways to penalize this is for particularly elite colleges, for particularly those institutions that are trying to make restitution, that say that they are, to do things like, we are not going to take you seriously. We are not going to take Florida students seriously without these credentials. You need to actually understand history. It's embarrassing to us to accept people from these universities, and that has nothing to do with the quality of the candidate. We believe that Florida students are capable, but Florida is deliberately miseducating and undereducating its students. And that suggests to students from all the other states where they are being properly educated that you do not need this knowledge in order to be a Georgetown grad student or to get into this school. We disagree. We do not believe that. If you do not have this knowledge, we will not take you seriously. And we need to make that clear to Florida that this will come with significant costs from the places that they esteem, that places that many people esteem as the brain trust or the path to the future for their children. So that Florida universities end up feeling very isolated. and to point out, like, you can fix this very easily by allowing Florida students to be on the same footing as their peers in other states. And to make that very clear that Florida is demeaning itself. Because once you do that, people are going to say, well, I don't want to block paths of opportunity for my kids. I don't want them to not be able to go to these kinds of schools. I think that, like, the opportunity to be properly educated is very important. Establishing that that's a proper level of education is very important. Establishing that there are going to be consequences for undermining your state education around its history. Florida, again, is a Jim Crow state. Historically, it was a state of the Confederacy. Historically, denying Black history is not just like a theoretical exercise like it is for possibly Hawaii, which has its own set of histories that need to be deeply explored in terms of white supremacy. But if they're not offering an AP African American history in Alaska, I'm not going to take it too personally. But if they were to suppress indigenous populations, I might start looking sideways, because those are people who, again, need to be centered in their discussions. And similarly, Florida has to center Black people because it is a state in which Black people have been historically oppressed and are being oppressed now. So making very clear that stuff like that is just not going to be tolerated. And then finally, really, really undermining Ron DeSantis as a national candidate and insisting that he is unfit for national office because of what he is doing in his state. He can be a despot all he wants, to the degree that we say, okay, well, there's literally no power that's stopping you, but we need to establish that being a despot is bad, and we don't want it spreading, and we're going to put a ring around the fire.
Do you consider him a better option than Trump? And I guess it's a loaded question, sort of better option for whom? But
I think he's a more plausibly deniable option than Trump. And I see a lot of people doing the work right now of explaining why he's not Trump. And that is more problematic to me than anything else. Fundamentally, Ron DeSantis is the slicker fascist that we were warned about when we were talking about Trump in 2016. Like, haha, don't laugh about this guy because someone's going to do it smarter. And when that happens, we're going to have very bad things. And then people are now saying, well, this smarter fascist seems to be less fascisty than this fascist. Like, no, that's exactly what we just told you to watch out for. Like, please do not do this. So there are a lot of reactionaries who are resistant to changing and do not want to lose power under a structure at which they might be expected to do things like keep Jim Crow in mind when they say things like, you can just run your state however you want. But well, oops, did I just say that George Wallace was right? The point is that, like, they don't want to lose that power, but there are things more important than whether or not they can get their paycheck from the Atlantic.
Yeah, well, that and ultimately it's about, just to close this out, it's the idea of the white supremacy, not wanting to acknowledge the white supremacy, or not wanting to acknowledge essentially Black people being an occupied nation, essentially, in America. So when convenient, conservatives will always talk about America, as Americans, all of us, e pluribus union. And in Florida, it's like, so when, again, Nichols is fine to have his opinion, right? I have no problem with that. My issue is what's fundamentally ignorant is to write something, and as you had phrased, it's the Atlantic as an institution, formerly an abolitionist publication, which to frame this as Floridians, the voters, out of the context of clearly this is a white majority voting to enact policies that oppress the minority. So you essentially have apartheid South Africa, which is actually not the case because that was, a white minority. But here, essentially similar policies, but it's okay because the majority is doing it. And that just seems dangerous. Like, we should acknowledge in our writing but it feels like there's a resistance towards doing that. If you do that, that's too woke. If you do that, if you talk about race, if you talk about DeSantis as a fascist, or dare you say even a racist or a bigot or a transphobe, that is too dangerous. You've got to like try to engage him in a different area, and that sort of would seem to put us at a disadvantage, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things, it was kind of cool. One of the things that I was looking at, like going through the data, was that there's this great piece, and I'm forgetting the writer, and I feel so bad because he did so much statistical analysis, but it was called The Blue Undertow of the Red Wave. And, obviously, this last cycle, Republicans did worse than they were expecting. A huge chunk of that can be attributed to Dobbs. Why you double down on that blows my mind, because they think they're winning, but whatever. The fundamental truth was, where people felt that they were being directly threatened, that they had an option between democracy and autocracy, and they felt that their choice was very clear, you got great Democratic turnout. Pennsylvania, Michigan, which both of them turned their state houses over as well. This was a down ticket advantage that bled all the way through. Josh Shapiro did bet great at the top of the ticket. John Fetterman squeaked out against a celebrity who should not have been present. You had a lot of great, but the state houses, that was the big one. The state house wins in Arizona, in Michigan, in Minnesota, in Maryland. Like, you started to see some really big shifts as Democrats started to gain trifectas back. And this is a huge deal, because when people have a very clear option between what they want and what they are offered, autocracy, they go for what they want. They choose democracy, but you have to be clear that that is the choice. And every time you back away from that, places like New York that backed away and absorbed a lot of Republican framing on issues, California, which accepted a lot of Republican framing on issues, the Karen Bass, Rick Caruso race. The more you accept Republican framing, the less that people feel that there's a significant difference between these parties. And what you need to do is heighten the contradictions. That sounds very Karl Rovian, but the truth is that if you're fighting a war with only one side, it's not a war, it's a massacre.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion, Caitlin, and always appreciate your voice. Where can people read you, read more of your work?
Yeah, everything I do is at Gotham Girl Blue. You can always find my work if you're typing it in anywhere. The only place I'm not right now might be like Tumblr. So yeah, get on the Twitter machine is where I live, but I'm on Mastodon. I'm on TikTok. I had a really fun Jackie Robinson TikTok about him being a Republican and then deciding never to vote for Republicans after Barry Goldwater. There's of really fun stuff that I do. So Gotham Girl Blue, and that is also the title of my Patreon. So if you're looking for ways to support my work, that's a great one.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you again soon.